In the unforgiving heat of Nevada's Ridgeway Valley, where fortunes were carved from stone and dreams often crumbled to dust, a desperate man made a choice that would reshape his destiny in ways he never imagined. Daniel Sawyer, a ranch hand, whose calloused palms had known more blisters than dollars, accepted a proposal from Margaret Thornfield, the 70-year-old widow of the legendary Crimson Crown mining empire. Their union lasted exactly 3 days before Daniel discovered a leather-bound diary hidden beneath loose floorboards, and within its yellowed pages lay revelations that would shake the very foundations of everything the mining world believed about power, sacrifice, and the true cost of wealth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The relentless Nevada sun had already climbed high by the time Daniel Sawyer finished mucking out the last stall at Morrison Ranch. August of 1978 was proving to be one of the driest on record, turning the landscape into a canvas of dusty browns and faded yellows. At 28, Daniel's weathered features made him look closer to 40, each line etched by too many seasons of hard labor and too few of good fortune. He pulled off his worn work gloves and examined his hands, rough as sandpaper, with dirt so deeply embedded under his nails that no amount of scrubbing seemed to help. Morrison Ranch wasn't much to look at. 40 acres of stubborn land that fought back against every attempt at prosperity. Frank Morrison, the owner, was fair enough. But there was only so much pay to go around when the cattle were thin and the well water ran low. Daniel had been working there for 3 years now, earning just enough to rent a cramped room behind the Pickaxe Saloon in Copper Springs. Some nights, when the desert wind howled through the gaps in the walls, he'd lie awake wondering how a man could work so hard and have so little to show for it. The sound of Frank's pickup truck grinding up the dirt road pulled Daniel from his thoughts. The old rancher climbed out, his face grim behind his gray mustache. "Need to talk to you, Dan," he said, removing his hat and wiping sweat from his brow. Daniel's stomach tightened. Those words never preceded good news. "I'm selling out," Frank continued, his voice heavy with resignation. "Can't make it work anymore. Bank's breathing down my neck, and with this drought." He trailed off, both men understanding what went unsaid. "Got a buyer coming from Reno next week. Wants to turn this place into some kind of tourist operation. Dude Ranch, he calls it." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. "How long do I have?" he managed to ask. Frank's weathered face showed genuine regret. "End of the month." "I'm sorry, Dan. You're a good hand. Best I've had. I'll write you a reference, whatever you need." A reference. As if a piece of paper could fill an empty stomach or pay for a roof over his head. Daniel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. What else was there to say? This was the way of things in Ridgeway Valley. The land gave, and the land took away, usually taking more than it ever gave. That evening, Daniel sat at the bar in the Pickaxe Saloon, nursing a beer he couldn't really afford. The place was nearly empty, just a few old-timers playing cards in the corner, and Maggie, the bartender, wiping down glasses with practiced efficiency. The television above the bar droned on about President Carter and gas prices. But Daniel wasn't listening. He was calculating 2 weeks of pay left, maybe 3 if Frank felt generous. His savings, such as they were, amounted to less than $200. Not enough for a security deposit anywhere, barely enough for gas money to the next town over. "You look like a man who's seen the bottom of a mine shaft," said a voice beside him. Daniel turned to find Earl McKenna settling onto the adjacent bar stool. Everyone called him Dusty, though whether from his years in the mines or his perpetually dirt-caked clothes was anyone's guess. The old man had to be pushing 70, with skin like leather and eyes that seemed to hold decades of secrets. "Morrison told me about selling out," Dusty continued, signaling Maggie for a whiskey. "Shame about that. Good land, if you knew how to work with it instead of against it." Daniel shrugged. Doesn't matter now. Come September, I'll be just another drifter looking for work. Dusty studied him over the rim of his glass, those sharp eyes taking measure. You ever think about trying something different? Mining, maybe? The question caught Daniel off guard. Mining? I don't know the first thing about pulling ore from rock. The old man chuckled, a sound like gravel in a tin cup. Neither did I when I started. Neither did Charlie Thornfield, for that matter, but look what he built. Everyone in Ridgeway Valley knew the Thornfield name. Charles Thornfield had struck silver back in '31, turned a hole in the ground into the Crimson Crown Mine, one of the most productive operations in Nevada. When he died 5 years ago, he'd left behind an empire worth millions and a widow who'd become something of a legend herself. Margaret Thornfield rarely came to town anymore, but when she did, people noticed. She moved like royalty through the dusty streets, her silver hair always perfectly styled, her clothes speaking of wealth that seemed almost foreign in a place like Copper Springs. Mrs. Thornfield still runs that operation, doesn't she? Daniel asked, more to make conversation than out of real interest. Dusty nodded slowly. She does, though word is she's been looking to make some changes. Getting on in years, you know. No children to pass things to. He paused, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Funny thing about the Thornfields, they always had a way of seeing potential where others saw nothing. Charlie found silver where 3 other prospectors had given up. Margaret turned a single mine into a whole corporation. Sometimes opportunity comes in unexpected packages. The old man finished his drink and stood, tossing a few bills on the bar. You might want to ride out to Thornfield Manor tomorrow, he said casually. Heard Mrs. Thornfield's been looking for someone to help with the horses. She's particular about who she hires, but... He shrugged. Man's got to try, doesn't he? With that cryptic advice, Dusty shuffled out into the night, leaving Daniel to ponder his words. The idea seemed absurd at first. The Thornfield estate was 15 miles out of town, a world apart from the simple ranches and modest homes of Copper Springs. What would someone like Margaret Thornfield want with a down-on-his-luck ranch hand? But as Daniel sat there, watching his last $20 dwindle with each sip of beer, he realized he had nothing to lose. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. The next morning dawned clear and hot, the sky a dome of perfect blue unmarred by clouds. Daniel rose before sunrise, shaved with care, and put on his least worn shirt, a blue cotton button-down that had only a few stains if you knew where to look. He polished his boots with spit and an old rag, trying to coax some shine from the cracked leather. His reflection in the cracked mirror above his wash basin didn't inspire confidence, but it was the best he could manage. The ride to Thornfield Manor took him along the old mining road, past abandoned claims and the occasional rusted piece of equipment half buried in sagebrush. As he drew closer to the estate, the landscape began to change. Irrigation had tamed sections of the desert, creating patches of green that seemed almost miraculous in the harsh environment. The road improved too, graded and graveled, lined with young cottonwood trees that provided blessed shade. When Thornfield Manor finally came into view, Daniel had to rein in his horse just to take it all in. The house rose from the desert like something out of a movie. 3 stories of cream-colored stone and dark timber with a wraparound porch and tall windows that caught the morning light. Gardens surrounded the main house, impossibly green lawns and flower beds that must have required a fortune in water alone. Behind the house, he could see stables, outbuildings, and in the distance, the industrial structures of the Crimson Crown mine operation. As Daniel approached the main gate, a man emerged from a small gatehouse. He was middle-aged, wearing a security uniform that seemed out of place in rural Nevada. "Help you?" the guard asked, his tone suggesting that help was the last thing on his mind. "I heard Mrs. Thornfield might be hiring," Daniel said, trying to project more confidence than he felt. "Thought I'd inquire about work." The guard's expression didn't change. "Mrs. Thornfield doesn't see people without appointments. You can leave your name and let him through, Robert." The voice came from a small intercom speaker beside. The gate, female, cultured with a slight accent Daniel couldn't quite place. The guard looked surprised, but pressed a button that sent the ornate iron gates swinging open. "Follow the main drive to the house," he instructed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I need to secure my legacy before—" She paused, then continued more softly, "before circumstances prevent me from doing so." There was something in her tone, a weariness that suggested more than simple age. Daniel found himself studying her more closely, noticing now the careful application of makeup that couldn't quite hide the pallor beneath, the slight tremor in her hands when she thought he wasn't looking. "Are you ill, Mrs. Thornfield?" he asked gently. Her eyes flashed, with surprise perhaps, or approval. "Perceptive. Yes, Mr. Sawyer, I am. My doctors give me perhaps a year, possibly less. Cancer, they tell me, though I find such labels limiting." She straightened in her chair. "Which is why I need to act quickly. The vultures are already circling, distant cousins who've suddenly remembered my existence, business rivals who see opportunity in a dying woman's empire." The brutally honest assessment left Daniel momentarily speechless. This woman, with all her wealth and power, was as desperate in her way as he was in his. "What about Mr. Whitman?" he asked, recalling the name of Thornfield Corporation's chief lawyer from local gossip. "Surely there are legal ways to protect your interests without—" "Marriage?" Margaret supplied. "Oh, Mr. Whitman has drawn up endless documents, trusts and foundations and corporate structures. But papers can be challenged, Mr. Sawyer, contested by clever lawyers and greedy relatives. A husband, however, a legal spouse with full inheritance, rights that's much harder to dispute." She leaned forward slightly. "I built this empire alongside Charles. I know every shaft, every claim, every contract. But I'm 70 years old and dying. The board members, the investors, they see weakness. They're already maneuvering, making alliances. Victor Hartley has been particularly bold, suggesting a merger that would essentially absorb Crimson Crown into his operation." Victor Hartley. Even Daniel knew that name. Hartley's Silver Works was Crimson Crown's biggest competitor, and rumors of bad blood between the companies were common knowledge in Copper Springs. "So you need someone to stand between them and Thornfield Corporation," Daniel said slowly. "Someone with no loyalty to anyone but you." "Precisely." Margaret's approval was evident. "You understand quickly, that's good. You'll need to." She stood again, moving to a desk in the corner of the room. "I won't pretend this arrangement won't have its challenges. People will talk. Some will assume you're a fortune hunter. Others will test you, try to prove you're unworthy of the Thornfield name." She opened a drawer and withdrew a document. "But I believe you have the strength to weather such storms. The question is, do you have the courage to accept my offer?" Daniel stared at the document in Margaret's hands, his throat suddenly dry. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed to intensify, making every detail in the room stand out with crystalline clarity. The fine grain of the mahogany desk, the delicate pattern on the china teacup, the slight tremor in Margaret's fingers as she held what he assumed was a marriage contract. "I need time to think," he said finally, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. Margaret nodded, setting the document back on the desk. "A reasonable request. However, time is the one commodity neither of us can afford to waste. I'll give you until sunset tomorrow. If you accept, we'll be married the following morning." The speed of it all made Daniel's head spin. "That's only 2 days. Surely there are legal requirements, waiting periods." Margaret's smile held a hint of amusement. Judge Richardson in Carson City is an old friend. He's already prepared to waive the usual formalities. When you have resources, Mr. Sawyer, certain obstacles become mere inconveniences. She returned to her chair, her movements careful but graceful. Should you accept, there are conditions you must understand. First, this marriage will be in name only. You'll have your own suite in the East Wing. We'll dine together most evenings. Appearances must be maintained, but your private life remains your own, within reason. Daniel nodded slowly, still trying to process the surreal turn his life had taken. Second, Margaret continued, you'll spend 6 months learning every aspect of the mining operation. My foreman, Jim Hensley, will oversee your education. He's been with Crimson Crown for 20 years and knows more about silver extraction than most engineers. You'll also work with Mr. Whitman to understand the legal and financial structures of the corporation. The business-like recitation of terms helped ground Daniel somewhat. This was a contract negotiation, nothing more. What about opposition from your board members, the other executives? He asked. Margaret's expression hardened slightly. They'll fall in line or be replaced. I still hold controlling interest in Thornfield Corporation. However, she paused, choosing her words carefully. There are those who will try to undermine you, to prove you're unsuitable. Victor Hartley in particular has allies within our organization. You must be prepared for that. Daniel thought of his empty bank account, his soon-to-be lost job, the threadbare existence he'd carved out in Copper Springs. What did he have to lose? And if I refuse, he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Then you return to your life, and I continue searching for a suitable candidate, Margaret replied simply. Though I confess my options are dwindling. Most men of appropriate age and station come with complications, families, debts, ambitions that conflict with my goals. She rose once more, signaling that their interview was drawing to a close. I won't pretend this is a fairy tale, Mr. Sawyer. You'll face scrutiny, criticism, perhaps even threats. The mining world can be brutal to outsiders, but I'm offering you something few men ever receive. A chance to completely transform your circumstances. Daniel stood as well, his mind churning with possibilities and dangers. Can I ask you something, Mrs. Thornfield? At her nod, he continued, why do you care so much about preserving the corporation? You have no children, no direct heirs. Why not just sell to the highest bidder and enjoy your remaining time in comfort? For the first time during their meeting, Margaret's composed facade cracked slightly. Her eyes grew distant, focused on something beyond the room's elegant confines. Because Crimson Crown isn't just a business, Mr. Sawyer. It's a testament to what's possible when you refuse to accept limitations. Charles and I built it from nothing, a played-out claim that everyone said was worthless. We proved them wrong. She moved to the window again, gazing out at the desert landscape. Do you know how many men told me I should sell after Charles died? That a woman couldn't run a mining operation. I doubled our profits in 5 years, expanded into new territories, modernized our extraction methods. Her voice carried a fierce pride. I won't let it be absorbed into Hartley's empire or picked apart by corporate raiders. Crimson Crown will continue as an independent operation, providing jobs for this community, supporting the families who've been loyal to us. That's the legacy I intend to preserve. The passion in her voice stirred something in Daniel. Here was a woman who'd spent decades fighting for her place in a man's world, who'd built something lasting despite countless obstacles. Could he do any less if given the chance? I'll need to collect my belongings from town, he said carefully, not quite ready to voice his decision, but knowing deep down that he'd already made it. Margaret turned from the window, a knowing look in her green eyes. Of course, Mrs. Bennet. Will give you my attorney's card. Should you decide to accept my offer, contact Mr. Whitman directly. He'll handle the arrangements." She moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing, Mr. Sawyer. Should you accept, you'll need to be prepared. For complete transparency, my enemies will dig into every aspect of your past, looking for leverage. Is there anything you haven't told me? Any secrets that might surface?" Daniel thought of his hard-scrabble life, the years of struggle since his parents' deaths. "No, ma'am, my life's been too ordinary for secrets. Just work and survival." Margaret studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. Ordinary can be a strength, Mr. Sawyer. It leaves fewer vulnerabilities for others to exploit." Mrs. Bennet appeared as if summoned, ready to escort him out. As Daniel followed the housekeeper through the grand hallways, his boots echoing. On polished floors, he felt as though he were walking between two worlds, the familiar life of daily struggle he was leaving behind, and an unknown future that promised both opportunity and danger. Outside, his horse waited patiently at the hitching post, looking as out of place as Daniel felt against the manicured backdrop of Thornfield Manor. As he mounted, Mrs. Bennet handed him an envelope. "Mrs. Thornfield asked me to give you this," she said, her expression neutral. Daniel tucked it into his shirt pocket, tipped his hat, and rode away, the weight of decision pressing down on him like the desert heat. The ride back to Copper Springs seemed to take forever, yet pass in an instant. Daniel's mind replayed the conversation with Margaret Thornfield, examining every word, every implication. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, the sun had climbed high overhead, baking the dusty streets and weathered buildings. His first stop was the bank, a grand name for what amounted to a converted storefront with a vault that had seen better days. Gerald Garrison, the bank manager, looked up from his ledger as Daniel entered. "Sawyer," he acknowledged with the minimal courtesy reserved for customers whose accounts barely warranted the paperwork. "What can I do for you?" "Need to check my balance," Daniel said, though he knew the amount to the penny. Sometimes seeing the actual figures helped clarify things. Garrison consulted his records with theatrical slowness. $173.42, he announced. "Will you be making a withdrawal?" Daniel stared at the figure written in Garrison's precise handwriting. Less than $200 to show for 28 years of life. "No," he said quietly. "No withdrawal today." As he turned to leave, Garrison called after him. "Heard Morrison's selling out. Shame about your job. If you need a loan to tide you over." The offer was half-hearted at best, both men knowing Daniel had no collateral worth lending against. Back on the street, Daniel retrieved the envelope Mrs. Bennet had given him. Inside was a business card for Walter Whitman, attorney at law, with an address in Carson City. But there was something else. A folded check made out to Daniel Sawyer for $5,000, signed by Margaret Thornfield. A note was attached. "For immediate expenses should you accept, consider it an advance against future earnings." MT. $5,000, more money than Daniel had seen in his entire life. His hands shook slightly as he refolded the check. This was real. The offer, the opportunity, all of it was real. He walked down Main Street in a daze, past familiar storefronts and faces he'd known for years. At the Pickaxe Saloon, he pushed through the swinging doors into the dim interior. The lunch crowd hadn't arrived yet, leaving the place nearly empty, except for Maggie behind the bar and a couple of old-timers at their usual table. Daniel took a seat at the bar, his mind still reeling. "Bit early for you, isn't it?" Maggie asked, but she was already reaching for a beer glass. "Just water," Daniel said, surprising them both. He needed a clear head now more than ever. As Maggie set the glass in front of him, the saloon doors swung open again. Dusty McKenna shuffled in, taking his customary stool 2 seats down from Daniel. "Heard you went out to Thornfield Manor this morning," the old man said without preamble. "How'd that work out?" Daniel studied Dusty more carefully now, remembering his suggestion from the night before. "You knew she wasn't looking for help. With horses, didn't you?" Dusty's weathered face crinkled into what might have been a smile. "Margaret Thornfield hasn't personally hired anyone for the stables in 15 years. Got people for that." He signaled Maggie for his usual whiskey. "But she's been asking questions around town. About you, specifically." "Why?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he knew the answer now. Dusty took a long sip of his whiskey before responding. "Because she's running out of time, and she knows. Because she built something worth preserving, and she's got no one to leave it to." He turned to face Daniel directly. "And because sometimes, when you're looking for a particular kind of person, you don't find them in the usual places." Daniel pulled out the check, showing it to Dusty. The old man whistled low. "That's a lot of zeros. Means she's serious." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Let me tell you something about Margaret Thornfield. She didn't get where she is by making bad bets. If she's chosen you, there's a reason. Question is, are you smart enough to take the chance?" The afternoon passed in a blur of preparations and second thoughts. Daniel gave notice at his rooming house, not mentioning his potential change in circumstances. He'd learned long ago that in small towns, news traveled fast enough without help. He packed his few possessions, clothes that now seemed more threadbare than ever, his father's old pocket knife, a photograph of his parents on their wedding day, and books he'd collected over the years. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Daniel found himself standing outside the small Western Union office, composing a telegram to Walter Whitman. His hand hesitated over the form. Once he sent this, there would be no going back. He thought of Margaret Thornfield, sitting in her elegant morning room, fighting to preserve something she and her husband had built from nothing. He thought of the check in his pocket, of the opportunity being offered. Mostly, he thought of the alternative, drifting from ranch to ranch, growing older and more worn with each passing season, until he ended up like so many other broken-down cowboys, telling stories in saloons about better days that had never really existed. "I accept the terms discussed," he wrote finally. "Please proceed with arrangements. Daniel Sawyer." The telegraph operator, a young man named Pete, read the message with professional disinterest. "That'll be $2, he said. Daniel paid, thinking it might be the last time he counted out coins so carefully. That evening, Daniel sat in his small room for what he knew would be the last time. Tomorrow would bring a new life, one he could barely imagine. He pulled out the photograph of his parents, studying their faces in the lamplight. His father had been about Daniel's age when the picture was taken, standing proud beside his new bride. They'd had such hopes then, such dreams for the future. The mining accident had ended those dreams, sending Daniel's life spiraling in directions they'd never anticipated. Now, in a strange twist of irony, mining would reshape his destiny once again. But this time, he wouldn't be descending into dark tunnels with a lunch pail and a prayer. This time, he'd be learning to manage an empire built on silver and determination. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. A knock at his door interrupted his reverie. Daniel opened it to find a well-dressed man in his 50s, with silver hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Mr. Sawyer, I'm Walter Whitman. I received your telegram." Daniel stepped aside to let him enter, acutely aware of how shabby his room must appear to someone accustomed to finer surroundings. Whitman seemed unbothered by the sparse accommodations, taking a seat on the room's only chair with easy grace. "Mrs. Thornfield asked me to deliver these documents personally," he said, withdrawing a leather portfolio from his briefcase. "I must say, she seems quite certain about this arrangement. That's unusual for her. She typically takes months to make major decisions." Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, accepting the portfolio with hands that weren't quite steady. "Did she explain why she chose me?" he asked. Whitman's expression was thoughtful. "Margaret Thornfield rarely explains her reasoning to anyone, myself included. However, I've worked with her for 15 years, and I've learned to trust her instincts. She has an uncanny ability to see potential where others see only problems." The attorney walked Daniel through the documents: prenuptial agreements, power of attorney forms, corporate bylaws that would need to be amended. The language was dense and legal, but Whitman translated it into plain English with patience. "The essential points are these," he summarized. "Upon marriage, you become her legal next of kin with full inheritance rights. However, the prenuptial agreement ensures that Thornfield Corporation remains intact. You cannot sell off assets piecemeal or merge with competitors. You'll receive a generous monthly allowance during Mrs. Thornfield's lifetime, and upon her passing, you inherit everything, but with those restrictions." "What about challenges?" Daniel asked. "Her board members, other executives who might object?" Whitman's smile was sharp. "Oh, there will be challenges. Victor Hartley alone has 3 law firms on retainer, but Margaret has been preparing for this. The corporate structure is solid, and as her husband, your position will be legally unassailable." He paused. "The real challenges will be personal, not legal. You'll need to prove yourself capable of running Crimson Crown, of understanding the complexities of modern mining operations. Margaret intends to teach you, but you'll need to be a quick study." They spent another hour reviewing details, with Whitman explaining the timeline for the next few days. "Judge Richardson will perform the ceremony tomorrow at 9 a.m. in Carson City. Private ceremony, just myself and Mrs. Bennett as witnesses. Afterward, we'll file the paperwork and hold a press conference to announce the marriage. Better to control the narrative than let rumors spread." The reality of it all was beginning to sink in. In less than 24 hours, Daniel would be married to one of the wealthiest women in Nevada. His life as a ranch hand would be over, replaced by something he could barely comprehend. "Is there anything else I should know?" he asked, as Whitman prepared to leave. The attorney considered the question carefully. "Margaret Thornfield is a remarkable woman, Mr. Sawyer. Brilliant, determined, and absolutely committed to preserving what she and Charles built. She's also dying, though she refuses to let that define her remaining time. She's chosen you for reasons that may not be immediately apparent, even to you. Trust that choice, and trust her judgment. And remember, you're not just marrying into wealth. You're accepting responsibility for hundreds of employees, for a company that's been the lifeblood of this region for decades. Don't take that lightly." After Whitman left, Daniel sat in the gathering darkness, not bothering to light the lamp. Tomorrow would be his wedding day. The thought was so absurd he almost laughed. He'd always imagined that if he married, it would be to some rancher's daughter, someone who understood the hard life, who wouldn't mind patched clothes and small dreams. Instead, he was marrying a woman old enough to be his grandmother, entering a world of corporate boardrooms and million-dollar decisions. Sleep eluded him that night. He lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind churning with questions and possibilities. When dawn finally broke, painting the desert sky in shades of pink and gold, Daniel rose and dressed in his best clothes, the same ones he'd worn to Thornfield Manor the day before. He packed his few belongings into a worn carpet bag, settled his bill with the landlord, and walked to the livery stable where he'd arranged to meet Whitman for the drive to Carson City. The lawyer arrived in a black Cadillac that looked impossibly out of place on Copper Springs' dusty streets. "Ready?" he asked as Daniel climbed into the passenger seat. Daniel nodded, not trusting his voice. As they drove out of town, he turned for one last look at the place that had been his home for 3 years. The Pickaxe Saloon, the general store, the feed shop, All the landmarks of his former life grew smaller in the rear window until they disappeared entirely. The drive to Carson City took 2 hours, through landscape that alternated between harsh desert and irrigated valleys. Whitman filled the silence with information about Thornfield Corporation, its various holdings, key personnel, ongoing projects. Daniel tried to absorb it all, but the magnitude of what he was stepping into kept overwhelming him. Carson City was the largest place Daniel had been since leaving Montana, a proper city with paved streets and buildings more than 2 stories tall. Whitman navigated through morning traffic to a stately courthouse in the city center. "Margaret's already inside," he said, pulling into a reserved parking space. "She arrived early this morning. Didn't want to risk being seen leaving town together." Too much fodder for gossip. The courthouse was cool and dim after the bright morning sun. Whitman led Daniel through marble corridors to a private chamber where Judge Richardson waited. The judge was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s with silver hair and a carefully trimmed beard. He greeted Whitman warmly, then turned to study Daniel with interest. "So you're the young man who's captured Margaret Thornfield's attention," he said. "I've known her for 30 years, Mr. Sawyer. She's one of the most formidable people I've ever met. The fact that she's chosen you speaks volumes." Before Daniel could respond, a side door opened and Margaret entered, followed by Mrs. Bennet. Margaret wore a suit of dove grey silk, elegant but understated. Her silver hair was arranged in a simple style, and she carried herself with the same regal bearing Daniel had noticed at their first meeting. She nodded to the judge, then turned to Daniel. "Mr. Sawyer, I trust you've had time to consider fully the step we're about to take." "Yes, ma'am," Daniel replied, his voice steady, despite the surreal nature of the moment. "I have." Something that might have been approval flickered in her eyes. "Then let's proceed." The ceremony was brief and businesslike. Judge Richardson read the legal requirements, had them sign documents, and pronounced them husband and wife, with a minimum of flourish. There was no exchange of rings, no kiss, just a firm handshake and the scratch of pens on paper. In less than 15 minutes, Daniel Sawyer became Daniel Thornfield, husband to one of Nevada's wealthiest women. "Mrs. Bennet will meet you at the front door." Daniel's horse seemed as overwhelmed as he was by the manicured grounds. The animal stepped carefully along the paved drive, its hooves clicking with unusual clarity in the still morning air. As they neared the house, Daniel spotted someone on the front steps, a woman in her 50s, wearing a grey dress and white apron. Mrs. Bennet, presumably. "Mr. Sawyer," she called out as he dismounted. Daniel started. He hadn't given his name. The housekeeper smiled at his confusion. "Mrs. Thornfield asked about you in town yesterday. She likes to know who's coming to her door." She studied him with shrewd eyes. "You can tie your horse at the post there. Mrs. Thornfield will see you in the morning room." The interior of Thornfield Manor was even more impressive than its exterior. Daniel followed Mrs. Bennet through a foyer floored with polished marble, past a sweeping staircase that curved up to unseen floors above. Paintings in heavy gold frames lined the walls, landscapes mostly, though Daniel noticed several that appeared to depict mining operations. The morning room, as Mrs. Bennet called it, faced east, its tall windows flooding the space with natural light. And there, seated in a high-backed chair with a china teacup balanced on her knee, was Margaret Thornfield. Daniel's first thought was that she looked nothing like he'd expected. At 70, she sat with the straight spine of someone who'd never learned to slouch. Her silver hair was arranged in an elegant style that reminded him of actresses from old movies. She wore a deep purple dress that somehow managed to be both formal and practical, and her green eyes, startlingly alert, fixed on him with an intensity that made him want to check if his shirt was properly tucked. "Daniel Sawyer," she said, setting her teacup on a small side table. "Please sit down. Would you care for coffee? Mrs. Bennet makes it strong enough to float a horseshoe. Daniel perched on the edge of an ornate chair, afraid his dusty clothes might soil the obviously expensive upholstery. No, thank you, ma'am. I appreciate you seeing me. Margaret Thornfield studied him for a long moment, those penetrating eyes, taking in every detail. You're not what I expected, she said finally. When I heard Frank Morrison was letting you go, I anticipated someone different. Daniel wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he remained silent. It seemed to be the right choice. Tell me about yourself, Mr. Sawyer, your family, your background. What brought you to Ridgeway Valley? The question opened a door Daniel usually kept firmly closed. Not much to tell, ma'am. Born in Montana. Father died when I was 12. Mining accident. Mother passed 2 years later. Been working ranches since I was 15. He paused, then added, came to Nevada figuring there'd be steady work. Been here 6 years now. A mining accident, Margaret repeated softly. Which mine? Daniel was surprised she'd latched onto that detail. The Anaconda copper mine. Cave-in during the night shift. They never recovered his body. Something flickered in Margaret's eyes. Sympathy, perhaps, or recognition. The mining life claims many good men. My husband used to say that the earth demands a price for her treasures. She stood gracefully, moving to the window that overlooked her gardens. What do you know about mining, Mr. Sawyer? Not much, Daniel admitted. Just what I picked up from the old-timers, my father's stories before he trailed off, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Margaret nodded as if he'd confirmed something she suspected. And yet mining's in your blood, whether you acknowledge it or not. The sons of miners often try to escape that heritage, only to find it calling them back. She turned from the window, fixing him with that penetrating gaze once more. I didn't bring you here to discuss horses, Mr. Sawyer. I have a proposition of an entirely different nature. Daniel felt his heartbeat quicken. Whatever he'd expected from this meeting, it wasn't this. I need a husband, Margaret continued, her tone as matter-of-fact as if she were discussing the weather. A legal union that will protect my interests and ensure the proper succession of the Thornfield legacy. The words hung in the air between them, so unexpected that Daniel wondered if he'd misheard. Mrs. Thornfield, I don't understand. She held up a hand, cutting him off. Let me be perfectly clear. I'm offering you a business arrangement, marriage in name only. You would live here, learn the mining business under my guidance, and eventually inherit the Crimson Crown operation. In exchange, I require loyalty, discretion, and a commitment to preserving what my husband and I built. Daniel's mind reeled. This was beyond anything he could have imagined when he'd ridden up that morning. Why me? He managed to ask. You could have your pick of. I mean, there must be men with experience, education. Margaret's smile was slight but genuine. Men with experience come with agendas. Men with education often lack wisdom. You, Mr. Sawyer, have something more valuable. Desperation tempered by dignity. You're at the end of your rope. Yet you rode here this morning with your boots polished and your pride intact. She moved back to her chair, settling into it with careful precision. I've spent weeks researching potential candidates. Your background is clean. No family entanglements, no debts beyond the ordinary, no vices that would embarrass the Thornfield name. You're a blank slate, Mr. Sawyer, and that's precisely what I need. The room fell silent, except for the tick of an ornate clock on the mantel. Daniel's thoughts churned, trying to process the magnitude of what was being offered. It's a lot to take in, he said finally. Margaret nodded. Of course, but time is a luxury neither of us possesses. You need employment. By month's end, acknowledge that you're learning, but emphasize your commitment to preserving the Thornfield legacy. The suit, fit perfectly, as if tailored specifically for him, which, Daniel realized, it probably had been. Margaret Thornfield didn't leave things to chance. He fumbled with the tie until Clemens diplomatically offered assistance. "There's significant interest in the personal angle," Clemens continued, adjusting the Windsor knot with practiced efficiency. "How you met, why Mrs. Thornfield chose you. We're keeping it simple. You met through mutual acquaintances, discovered shared values regarding land stewardship and worker welfare. The marriage represents a meeting of minds, not just a business arrangement." "Even though that's exactly what it is?" Daniel asked, meeting Clemens' eyes in the mirror. The PR director's expression didn't change. "Truth and messaging aren't always identical, Mr. Thornfield. Our job is to control the narrative. The press will speculate regardless. Better to give them a story that serves our interests than let them create their own." They spent the next hour rehearsing responses to likely questions. Clemens was thorough, professional, and surprisingly patient with Daniel's occasional stumbles. By the time they finished, Daniel felt marginally more prepared for the ordeal ahead. "One last thing," Clemens said, as they prepared to leave for Carson City. "There will almost certainly be questions about Mrs. Thornfield's health. She's been very private about her condition, but rumors have circulated. The official response is that she's in excellent health for her age and fully engaged in running the corporation. Any suggestion otherwise is dismissed as unfounded speculation." The drive to Carson City felt shorter this time, perhaps because Daniel's mind was occupied with the upcoming press conference. Clemens continued his coaching during the journey, pointing out potential pitfalls and suggesting ways to redirect difficult questions. By the time they reached the Thornfield Corporation headquarters, a modern 6-story building in the heart of the business district, Daniel's head was spinning with information. The lobby was all glass and polished granite, with a massive silver sculpture that might have been abstract art or a stylized representation of mine machinery. Employees paused in their activities to stare as Daniel passed, whispers following in his wake. The executive elevator whisked them to the top floor, where the press conference would be held in the corporate boardroom. The room was already filling with reporters when they arrived. Television cameras lined the back wall, their operators making final adjustments. Print journalists occupied rows of chairs, notebooks and tape recorders at the ready. Daniel recognized a few faces from the Copper Springs weekly paper, but most were strangers representing major Nevada and California outlets. Margaret had already arrived, seated at the head of a long conference table. She'd changed into a burgundy suit that complemented her silver hair, and she looked every inch the corporate titan. Walter Whitman sat to her right, shuffling through legal documents. An empty chair to her left waited for Daniel. "Ah, Mr. Thornfield," Margaret said as he approached, her use of his new name deliberately clear for the assembled press. "Please, join us. We'll begin in a few moments." Daniel took his seat, hyper-aware of the cameras already rolling, capturing every gesture and expression. Margaret leaned slightly toward him, her voice low enough that the microphones wouldn't catch it. "Remember, confidence without arrogance. Defer to me on business specifics, but don't be afraid to speak about your background and values. These vultures smell fear. Don't give them any." Whitman stood, calling the room to order. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Mrs. Thornfield has a brief statement, after which we'll take questions." Margaret rose gracefully, commanding immediate attention. "Good afternoon. I'm pleased to announce my marriage to Daniel Thornfield, formerly Daniel Sawyer, which took place this morning in a private ceremony. This union represents not just a personal commitment, but a strategic decision for the future of Thornfield Corporation." She paused, her green eyes sweeping the room. "For 47 years, I've dedicated my life to building and preserving this company alongside my late husband, Charles. That commitment remains unchanged." What changes today is the addition of fresh perspective and energy to our leadership team. Daniel brings a deep understanding of the land and its people, qualities essential to responsible mining operations in the modern era. The statement was brief, carefully worded, and delivered with the authority of someone accustomed to controlling rooms full of powerful people. When she sat, the questions began immediately. Mrs. Thornfield, can you comment on the sudden nature of this marriage? You've been widowed for 5 years without any public romantic connections. Margaret's smile was cool, professional. Privacy is a luxury I've always valued. Daniel and I chose to keep our relationship out of the public eye until we were certain of our path forward. Mr. Thornfield, another reporter called out, your background is in ranch work. What qualifies you to help run a major mining corporation? Daniel drew a breath, remembering Clement's coaching. You're right that my experience is with the land, not in boardrooms, but understanding the land, its rhythms, its demands, its relationship with the people who work it. That's fundamental to any resource extraction business. I'm here to learn, to bring fresh eyes to established practices, and to ensure that Thornfield Corporation continues to operate with integrity and respect for both workers and environment. The questions continued for 40 minutes, ranging from pointed inquiries about the age difference to speculation about corporate succession plans. Daniel fielded his share with growing confidence, while Margaret deflected the more aggressive probes with practiced ease. Throughout it all, Whitman sat silent but alert, ready to intervene if legal lines were crossed. One final question, the moderator announced. A reporter from the Reno Gazette stood. Mr. Thornfield, there are those who might see this marriage as opportunistic. What would you say to people who believe you're simply taking advantage of an elderly widow? Daniel felt heat rise in his face, but before he could respond, Margaret's hand touched his arm lightly. He understood the message. Let her handle this one. I've built my fortune and my reputation by recognizing value where others see only surface appearances, Margaret said, her voice carrying a steel edge. I suggest those people reserve judgment until they see what Daniel accomplishes in the coming months. Actions, not speculation, will prove the wisdom of this decision. With that, Whitman stood again. Thank you all for coming. A formal press release with additional details will be distributed later today. The dismissal was clear, and reporters began packing up their equipment, though many threw additional questions that went unanswered. As the room emptied, Margaret turned to Daniel. You did well, better than I expected for your first time in the spotlight. The praise was measured but genuine. We'll return to Thornfield Manor separately again. I have board members to placate, fires to extinguish before the rumors spread too far. Mrs. Bennett will have dinner prepared for 7. We'll dine together and discuss the next steps in your education. She left with Whitman, their heads together in quiet conversation as they walked. Clemens appeared at Daniel's elbow. Not bad for a rookie, he said with a slight smile. The questions will get harder as people dig into your background, but you've set a good baseline. Humble, earnest, committed to learning. The media loves an underdog story. We can work with that angle. The ride back to Ridgeway Valley gave Daniel time to process the afternoon's events. He'd been married, faced the press as Daniel Thornfield, and survived his first test in Margaret's world. But he couldn't shake the feeling that these were merely opening moves in a much larger game, whose rules he barely understood. Thornfield Manor looked different as they approached in the late afternoon light. No longer an intimidating symbol of unattainable wealth, it was now his home, or would be once he figured out how to inhabit it without feeling like an imposter. Mrs. Bennett met him at the door, her expression marginally warmer than that morning. The early edition evening papers have arrived, she said, holding out several newspapers. I thought you might want to see how the press conference was covered. The headlines ranged from factual to sensational. Mining heiress Margaret Thornfield weds ranch hand, read the Carson City Tribune. December-May, marriage rocks Nevada mining world, proclaimed the Reno Evening News. The Copper Springs Gazette, clearly working with limited information, simply announced, "Local man marries Thornfield widow." Daniel carried the papers to his suite, spreading them across the coffee table in his sitting room. The articles varied in tone, some focusing on the business implications, others speculating about the personal dynamics. Several included photos from the press conference. Daniel was startled to see how comfortable he looked in his expensive suit, seated beside Margaret as if he belonged there. A soft knock interrupted his reading. "Come in," he called, expecting Mrs. Bennet with some household matter. Instead, a man entered who could only be described as weathered, late 60s, with skin like leather and pale blue eyes that seemed to have stared into too many dark places. He wore work clothes, but clean ones, and carried himself with the careful dignity of someone who'd earned his position through decades of hard labor. "Mr. Thornfield, Jim Hensley, mine foreman. Mrs. Thornfield asked me to stop by, introduce myself since we'll be working together." His handshake was firm, calloused, hands that knew real work. "Please call me Daniel," he said, grateful to meet someone who might understand his background better than lawyers and PR directors. "I understand you'll be teaching me the mining operations." Hensley's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. "Teaching might be too fancy a word. Showing you the ropes, more like. Mining's not something you learn from books, though there's plenty of those too. It's about understanding the rock, reading the signs, knowing when to push forward and when to pull back." He moved to the window, gazing out at the mountains where Crimson Crown's operations sprawled. "Charles Thornfield gave me my first job, underground, when I was 18. That was 42 years ago. Worked my way up from mucker to shift boss to foreman. Seen 3 major expansions, 2 cave-ins, more silver pulled from these hills than most folks can imagine." "Mrs. Thornfield said you know more about extraction than most engineers," Daniel offered. Hensley snorted. "Engineers. They're useful enough, but most of them learn their trade in classrooms. Real mining knowledge comes from breathing dust, feeling the mountain's moods, understanding that every ton of ore costs something in sweat and sometimes blood." He turned back to Daniel. "Mrs. Thornfield says you've got ranch background. That's good. Means you understand that the land has its own ways, its own demands. Mining's not so different, except we're taking from the earth instead of working with it." They talked for nearly an hour, Hensley sharing stories of the mine's history, explaining the basic operations, preparing Daniel for what he'd see during tomorrow's tour. Unlike the polished corporate types Daniel had met so far, Hensley spoke, plainly without agenda or pretense. "There's something you should know," Hensley said, as he prepared to leave. "Not everyone at Crimson Crown is happy about this marriage. Some folks think Mrs. Thornfield should have sold out to Hartley, taken the money and retired comfortable. Others figure an outsider can't understand what we do here. You'll face resistance, subtle and otherwise." Daniel nodded. "I expected as much. Any advice?" "Listen more than you talk. Respect the knowledge of men who've spent their lives underground. Don't pretend to know things you don't. And remember, every decision you make affects real people with families to feed. The miners don't care about stock prices or corporate strategies. They care about safe working conditions and steady paychecks." Hensley paused at the door. "Do right by them, and they'll accept you eventually. Maybe even respect you. But that's earned, not given." After Hensley left, Daniel found himself standing at the window, looking out at the same view the foreman had studied. Somewhere in those hills, hundreds of men labored in dark tunnels, extracting wealth from stone. Soon, he'd be responsible for their safety, their livelihoods. The weight of it pressed down on him like the mountain itself. The afternoon faded into evening, and Daniel prepared for dinner with Margaret. He chose clothes from his new wardrobe, casual, by Thornfield standards, but still finer than anything he'd previously owned. As he dressed, he thought about the strange turn his life had taken. This morning, he'd been a single man facing unemployment. Tonight, he was married to one of Nevada's wealthiest women, preparing to dine in a mansion that was now his home. The dining room was as formal as every other space in Thornfield Manor. A table that could seat 20 was set for 2, with Margaret's place at the head and Daniel's to her right. Candles flickered in silver candelabras, casting dancing shadows. On the walls, Margaret was already seated when he arrived, wearing a simple black dress that somehow managed to be both elegant and businesslike. "Daniel," she acknowledged as he took his seat, "I trust your afternoon was productive." "Jim Hensley stopped by," Daniel replied, as Mrs. Bennet appeared with the first course, a soup he couldn't identify, but which tasted better than anything he'd ever eaten. "He seems like a man who knows his business." "Jim's forgotten more about mining than most people ever learn," Margaret agreed. "He's also one of the few people I trust completely. Listen to everything he tells you." She paused, studying him, over her wine glass. "The press conference went better than anticipated. You handled yourself well." "I had good coaching," Daniel admitted. "Your PR director knows his job. Roger is competent, but coaching only goes so far. You showed natural poise. That can't be taught." She set down her glass, her expression becoming more serious. "Tomorrow, the real education begins. Jim will take you underground, show you the active operations. It's dangerous work, even for observers. You'll need to sign additional liability waivers." The matter-of-fact mention of danger sent a chill through Daniel. His father had died, underground, crushed in a cave-in that had claimed 3 other lives. The thought of descending into those dark tunnels awakened fears he'd buried for years. Margaret seemed to read his thoughts. "Your father was killed in a mining accident, wasn't he, in Montana?" When Daniel nodded, she continued more gently. "Crimson Crown has an excellent safety record. We've had no fatalities in 15 years, only minor injuries. Jim runs a tight operation, but I understand if you'd prefer to limit your underground exposure." "No," Daniel said, surprising himself with the firmness of his response. "If I'm going to run this company to protect your legacy, I need to understand every aspect of it, including the risks the miners face daily." Something shifted in Margaret's expression, approval perhaps, or reassessment. Charles felt the same way. He went underground at least once a month, even in his 70s, said it kept him honest, reminded him that spreadsheets and profit margins were built on human courage. They continued through dinner, lamb with vegetables Daniel couldn't name, prepared with a delicacy that made even simple ingredients seem exotic. Margaret spoke of the company's history, its evolution from a single mine to a diversified corporation, with interests in processing, transportation, and emerging technologies. "The future of mining isn't just about extraction," she explained over dessert. "It's about efficiency, environmental responsibility, worker safety. Hartley and his ilk still operate like it's 1920. Maximum extraction, minimum investment in anything that doesn't directly increase tonnage. That's why they'll ultimately fail." "And Thornfield Corporation?" Daniel asked. "We're positioned for the future. New extraction techniques that reduce environmental impact, investment in worker, training and safety equipment, research into mineral processing that increases yield while reducing waste." She leaned forward slightly. "This is what you're inheriting, Daniel. Not just a mining operation, but a vision for how the industry should evolve." After dinner, Margaret suggested they adjourn to the library. The room was even more impressive by lamplight, walls of books reaching toward a coffered ceiling. comfortable chairs arranged around a massive fieldstone fireplace. Margaret moved to a section devoted to mining texts, pulling out several volumes. "These are the basics," she said, handing him books on geology, extraction techniques, and corporate finance. "Not light reading, but essential. You'll need to understand the technical language, the financial structures, the regulatory environment. Jim can teach you the practical aspects, but this knowledge is equally important." Daniel accepted the books, their weight somehow symbolic of the education ahead. "How long did it take you to learn all this?" Margaret's smile held a trace of memory. "Congratulations," Whitman said, though his tone was more professional than celebratory. "The press conference is scheduled for 2 this afternoon at the Thornfield Corporation offices. That gives us time to file the paperwork and prepare statements." Margaret turned to Daniel, her expression unreadable. "We'll return to Ridgeway Valley separately. I have business to conclude here first. Mrs. Bennett will accompany you back to Thornfield Manor. Your belongings have already been moved to your suite." The efficiency of it all left Daniel slightly breathless. Less than 48 hours ago, he'd been an unemployed ranch hand facing homelessness. Now he was married to Margaret Thornfield, preparing to face the press as her husband and heir to a mining empire. The transformation was so complete, so sudden, that he felt disconnected from his own life, as if watching someone else's story unfold. As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Margaret paused beside him. "Remember," she said quietly, "from this moment forward, you represent not just yourself, but the Thornfield name. Every action, every word will be scrutinized. Be careful, be dignified, and above all, be strong. The challenges begin now." With that warning echoing in his ears, Daniel followed Mrs. Bennett to a waiting car, beginning his journey back to Thornfield Manor, no longer as a visitor, but as its master. The thought should have been exhilarating. Instead, he felt only the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders like a heavy coat he wasn't sure he was strong enough to wear. The desert landscape flashed past the car windows. Familiar, yet suddenly strange, as if his change in circumstances had altered the very world around him. 3 days, Margaret had said at their first meeting. 3 days to learn the business, to understand his role, to prepare for whatever revelations awaited. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that those 3 days would be the most important of his life, though he couldn't yet imagine why. As Thornfield Manor came into view, its elegant facade gleaming in the afternoon sun, Daniel thought about secrets and sacrifices, about the price of wealth and the weight of legacy. Somewhere in that grand house, among the polished floors and priceless artwork, lay the answers to questions he hadn't yet learned to ask. But first, he had a press conference to survive, a new life to navigate, and a dying woman's trust to justify. The car pulled up to the front entrance, and Mrs. Bennett turned to him with something that might have been sympathy in her eyes. "Welcome home, Mr. Thornfield," she said. The word sounded strange, foreign, impossible. But as Daniel stepped out of the car and looked up at the mansion that was now his home, he realized there was no going back. He was Daniel Thornfield now, for better or worse, and in 3 days' time he would discover exactly what that meant. The east wing of Thornfield Manor stretched before Daniel like something out of a dream. Mrs. Bennett led him down a wide hallway lined with oil paintings of desert landscapes and mining operations, their footsteps muffled by thick Persian runners. Crystal sconces cast warm light on wallpaper that probably cost more than Daniel's yearly wages at Morrison Ranch. "Your suite is at the end of this corridor," Mrs. Bennett said, her voice echoing slightly in the high-ceiling space. "Mrs. Thornfield, thought you'd appreciate the view of the mountains." She stopped at a set of double doors crafted from dark mahogany, producing a brass key from her ring. "Your belongings have already been unpacked. There are clothes in the wardrobe, Mr. Whitman provided your measurements to the tailor in Carson City. They should fit adequately until proper alterations can be made. The doors swung open to reveal a sitting room that could have swallowed Daniel's entire former lodging. Tall windows faced west, offering a panoramic view of the Sierra Nevada range. Leather armchairs flanked a stone fireplace, and built-in bookshelves held volumes that looked like they'd actually been read, not just displayed for show. Through an archway, he glimpsed a bedroom with a four-poster bed and more space than any one person could possibly need. "The bathroom is through there," Mrs. Bennet continued, indicating another door. "Hot water is always available. There's a small study adjacent to the bedroom if you need privacy for business matters. Meals are served in the main dining room. Breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6:30. Mrs. Thornfield expects punctuality." Daniel stood in the center of the room, feeling like an intruder in someone else's life. His worn carpet bag looked absurdly out of place on the polished oak floor. "Thank you, Mrs. Bennet," he managed. "This is overwhelming." Her stern expression softened slightly. "It always is at first. When I came to work here 25 years ago, I spent my first week getting lost in the corridors." She moved to the windows, adjusting the heavy drapes. "Mrs. Thornfield will be back from Carson City this evening. The press conference is at 2. Mr. Whitman will brief you on what to expect. There's a suit laid out on your bed, the dark blue one. It photographs well." After she left, Daniel explored his new quarters with the cautious curiosity of a man who couldn't quite believe his surroundings were real. The closet, larger than most bedrooms he'd known, contained more clothes than he'd owned in his entire life. Suits, shirts, casual wear, even formal evening attire. Everything in shades of gray, blue, and black. Conservative, dignified. The uniform of a man who belonged in boardrooms rather than stables. The bathroom was a revelation. Gleaming white fixtures, marble countertops, towels so plush they felt like clouds. Daniel ran his calloused hands over the smooth surfaces, marveling at the contrast. These hands that had mended fences and birthed calves were now expected to sign million-dollar contracts. He found the suit Mrs. Bennet had mentioned. Navy, blue wool that felt impossibly fine between his fingers. A crisp white shirt, silk tie in Thornfield corporate colors of silver and deep blue, and shoes that gleamed like black mirrors. Daniel held the jacket up, studying his reflection in the full-length mirror. The man looking back at him was a stranger. A knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, expecting Mrs. Bennet or perhaps Whitman. Instead, a younger man entered, mid-30s, with sandy hair and an eager expression. He wore a less expensive version of the suit Daniel was about to put on. "Mr. Thornfield? I'm Roger Clemens, Public Relations Director for Thornfield Corporation. Mr. Whitman asked me to help prepare you for the press conference." He carried a leather portfolio and the slightly harried air of someone juggling too many responsibilities. "I've prepared some talking points, anticipated questions, that sort of thing. The press can be aggressive when it comes to sudden marriages involving substantial fortunes." Daniel shook the offered hand, noting Clemens' firm grip and direct gaze. "I appreciate the help. This is all rather new to me." "Of course, sir. Perhaps we could go over the basics while you dress. Time is somewhat limited." Clemens settled into one of the leather chairs, opening his portfolio. "The key message we want to convey is continuity. Mrs. Thornfield isn't stepping down. She's bringing in fresh perspective to help guide Thornfield Corporation into the future. You're not replacing anyone. You're adding value." As Daniel changed, "Clothes in the bedroom," Clemens called out key points through the open door. "Your background is actually an asset. Ranch work demonstrates understanding of the land, connection to the working community. Don't try to pretend expertise you don't have. Years Charles was patient but demanding. He believed in total immersion, board meetings in the morning, underground tours in the afternoon, financial reviews in the evening. It was exhausting but effective. She moved to an ornate desk in the corner, unlocking a drawer with a small key from her pocket. "There's something else you should have," she said, withdrawing a leather-bound journal. This was Charles's personal notebook from our early years. His observations about the business, the challenges we faced, the decisions that shaped Thornfield. Corporation. I've kept it locked away since his death, but you should read it. Understanding the past is essential to navigating the future. Daniel took the journal reverently. The leather was worn smooth with handling, and when he opened it, Charles Thornfield's bold handwriting sprawled across yellowed pages. "Thank you," he said, meaning it. I understand the trust you're placing in me." "Trust must be earned," Margaret replied, but her tone was gentle. "This is a beginning. The real test comes in the weeks and months ahead." She returned to her chair by the fireplace. "I won't lie to you, Daniel. The path ahead is difficult. You'll face skepticism, resistance, even hostility. Some will see you as an interloper, others as a gold digger. The only way to prove them wrong is through actions, not words." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling softly. Daniel found himself studying Margaret, seeing beyond the composed exterior to the woman underneath. She looked tired despite her rigid posture, and occasionally her hand moved to her side in a gesture that might have indicated pain. "Are you feeling unwell?" he asked carefully. Her eyes sharpened. "My health is manageable. The doctors adjust medications. I adjust expectations. It's an ongoing negotiation with mortality." She paused. "But I didn't bring you here to be my nursemaid. I need someone who can learn quickly, make hard decisions, stand up to pressure. Sympathy, while appreciated, is not required." The rebuke was gentle but clear. Daniel nodded, filing the information away. Margaret Thornfield would face her illness on her own terms, without pity or excessive concern from others. "I should retire," she said, rising from her chair with careful grace. "Tomorrow will be demanding. Jim starts his underground tours at 6. He believes the mine shows its true character in the early morning hours. Mrs. Bennett will wake you at 5. As she moved toward the door, she paused. "Daniel, you asked earlier how long it took me to learn the business. The truth is, I'm still learning. Every day brings new challenges, new complexities. The moment you think you understand it all is the moment you become vulnerable to those who never stopped learning." With that wisdom, she left him alone in the library. Daniel sat for a while longer, Charles Thornfield's journal in his lap, surrounded by books that contained the knowledge he'd need to master. The fire burned low as he finally opened the journal, beginning to read the words of a man who'd built an empire from nothing but determination and desert rock. The first entry was dated 1931, found silver today, where Thompson said there was nothing but worthless quartz. The mountain keeps its secrets close, but persistence pays. Margaret thinks I'm wasting our savings on a fool's dream. Perhaps she's right, but sometimes you have to gamble everything on a vision others can't see. Daniel read until his eyes grew heavy, absorbing Charles Thornfield's insights about mining, business, and life. When he finally made his way to his suite, the grandfather clock in the hall chimed midnight. His first day as Daniel Thornfield was ending. Tomorrow, the real education would begin. As he prepared for bed in his luxurious bathroom, Daniel caught sight of himself in the mirror. The expensive clothes were gone, leaving just a man who looked remarkably like he had days ago, weathered, uncertain, standing at the threshold of something beyond his comprehension. But something in his eyes had changed. A determination, perhaps, or the first glimmer of understanding about the magnitude of what he'd undertaken. In 3 days, Margaret had said at their first meeting, 3 days to prepare for. What? She hadn't specified, but Daniel sensed the timeline carried significance. 3 days to prove himself worthy? 3 days before some crucial test or revelation? He thought of his father, crushed in the darkness of a Montana mine, and wondered what he would think of his son's strange fate. Outside, the desert wind whispered around the corners of Thornfield Manor, carrying the faint scent of sage and dust. Somewhere in the darkness, the Crimson Crown mine waited, its tunnels reaching deep into the earth like the roots of some ancient tree. Tomorrow, Daniel would descend into that darkness, following in the footsteps of Charles Thornfield and countless others who'd sought fortune in the mountain's heart. As sleep finally claimed him, Daniel's last thought was of Margaret's words, "The moment you think you understand it all is the moment you become vulnerable." There was so much he didn't understand, so much to learn. But for the first time in years, that uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. He was Daniel Thornfield now, heir to an empire built on silver and secrets. Whatever the next 3 days might bring, he would face it with the same determination that had allowed a desperate ranch hand to gamble everything on an unlikely opportunity. The desert night deepened, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. In the master suite at the other end of the manor, Margaret Thornfield lay awake, perhaps thinking of her own gamble, her own desperate choice to trust a stranger with everything she'd built. And deep beneath the earth, the Crimson Crown mine kept its silence, waiting to reveal its mysteries to the man who would soon hold its future in his calloused hands. The alarm shattered Daniel's sleep at 5 a.m., earlier than he'd risen even during his ranch hand days. His body protested as he rolled out of the impossibly comfortable bed, muscles still adjusting to sleeping on a mattress that didn't sag. In the middle, the bathroom's bright lights made him squint as he splashed cold water on his face, trying to shake off the strange dreams that had haunted him. Visions of silver veins running through darkness, of his father's voice echoing from somewhere deep underground. By the time he'd dressed in the work clothes Mrs. Bennet had laid out, sturdy denim, steel-toed boots, and a heavy canvas jacket, the eastern sky showed the first pale hints of dawn. He found coffee and a simple breakfast waiting in the kitchen, along with a note in Mrs. Bennet's precise handwriting, "Mr. Hensley will meet you at the mine office. Main entrance, north side of the property. Take the white pickup in the garage." The truck was spotless, keys waiting in the ignition. As Daniel drove through the pre-dawn darkness, headlights cutting through the desert gloom, he noticed other vehicles heading in the same direction. The morning shift, he realized. Men who'd been making this journey for years, perhaps decades, while he'd been sleeping in his rented room behind a saloon. The Crimson Crown mine complex materialized out of the darkness like a small city. Floodlights, illuminated industrial buildings, conveyor systems, and the main shaft's headframe rising against the sky like a steel monument. The parking lot was already filling with trucks and aging sedans as miners arrived for their shift. Daniel parked near the office building, a low structure that looked like it had been built in stages over many years. Jim Hensley waited inside, studying a large map mounted on the wall. He turned as Daniel entered, his weathered face creasing into what might have been approval. Right on time. Good. The mountain doesn't respect banker's hours. He gestured to a row of lockers. Gear. Up. Helmet, lamp, emergency respirator. The works. As Daniel equipped himself with the unfamiliar equipment, Hensley continued his orientation. Crimson Crown runs 3 shifts round the clock except Sundays. We're working 5 active faces right now, following veins at different depths. The original shaft goes down 800 feet, but the newer workings extend almost twice that. The helmet felt heavy on Daniel's head, the lamp adding extra weight. Hensley adjusted the straps with practiced efficiency, checking each piece of equipment. First rule underground, never go anywhere alone. Second rule, if something feels wrong, it probably is. The mountain talks to those who listen. Creaking timber, changes in airflow, the way the rock sounds under your pick. Pay attention to everything. They walked to the main shaft where a group of miners waited by the cage, the elevator that would take them underground. Daniel noticed the curious glances, the whispered conversations that stopped as they approached. These men knew who he was, what he represented. Their expressions ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. "Morning, boys," Hensley called out. "This is Daniel Thornfield. He'll be touring the operation today, getting a feel for how we do things." The foreman's tone brooked no argument, but Daniel could feel the tension. These men worked for him now, technically, but he was the outsider, the ranch hand who'd married into ownership. The cage was larger than Daniel expected, able to hold 20 men comfortably. As they crowded in, he found himself pressed between Hensley and a younger miner with coal-black hair and suspicious eyes. The gates clanged shut, and with a lurch that left Daniel's stomach somewhere around his throat, they began their descent. The shaft walls blurred past, occasionally lit by bare bulbs that flashed by like dying stars. The air grew cooler, carrying scents of damp rock and machine oil. Daniel fought down memories of his father's stories about the Anaconda mine, about the day the mountain had claimed him. "First time underground?" the young miner asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes," Daniel admitted, grateful his voice didn't shake. "Gets easier," the miner said, then added with a slight edge, "unless you're planning to run things from an office like most owners." Before Daniel could respond, the cage slowed, stopping at what Hensley announced as the 600-foot level. Most of the miners exited here, heading off down tunnels that disappeared into darkness. The cage continued down with just Hensley, Daniel, and a few others who were bound for deeper levels. "That was Pete Kowalski," Hensley said as they descended further. Third-generation miner. His grandfather worked for Charles Thornfield when Crimson Crown first opened. Good man, but protective of his own. They all are. The cage finally stopped at the 1,000-foot level. As they stepped out into a carved chamber lit by strings of electric bulbs, Daniel felt the weight of the mountain pressing down. Somewhere, far above, sunlight was breaking over the desert. Down here, day and night had no meaning. "Main working level," Hensley explained, leading the way down a tunnel wide enough for small vehicles. "We run electric locomotives to haul ore cars to the shaft. Ventilation fans keep the air moving. See those pipes? Compressed air for the drilling equipment and water lines for dust suppression." As they walked deeper into the mine, Hensley provided constant commentary. He showed Daniel how to read the geological markers, explained the timbering system that prevented cave-ins, demonstrated how the miners followed veins of silver-bearing ore through the rock. The complexity of the operation was staggering. An underground city with its own transportation network, power grid, and safety systems. They reached an active working phase where a crew was preparing to blast. The miners paused in their work as Hensley and Daniel approached, their headlamps creating a constellation of lights in the darkness. The crew boss, a grizzled man named Sullivan, gave Hensley a nod but barely acknowledged Daniel. "Setting charges for the afternoon blast," Sullivan reported. "It should open up another 30 feet if the geology reports are right." Hensley turned to Daniel. "Want to see how it's done? The placement of explosives is crucial. Too much and you damage the ore body, too little and you waste time and money." For the next hour, Daniel watched as the crew drilled precisely placed holes in the rock face, each one calculated to fracture the stone in specific patterns. The miners worked with an efficiency born of long practice, their movements coordinated, despite the confined space. Gradually, Daniel noticed something changing in their attitude. His questions were practical, focused on understanding rather than asserting authority. He showed genuine interest in their expertise, and slowly the hostility began to thaw. "Your old man was a miner, weren't he?" Sullivan asked during a break, offering Daniel a drink from his water bottle. "Montana copper," Daniel confirmed. "Died when I was 12. Sullivan nodded slowly. "Tough way to lose a father. Mine went the same way, up in Butte. Cave-in during a storm when the pumps failed." He studied Daniel with new interest. "Maybe you understand more than we figured." As they prepared to move to another section of the mine, a low rumble echoed through the tunnels. Daniel tensed, but Hensley just checked his watch. Blasting on the 1200 level, right on schedule. He noticed Daniel's reaction. "You'll learn to read the mountain's moods." That was controlled, expected. The sounds that worry us are different. Sharp cracks, grinding noises, sudden silence where there should be ventilation. They visited 3 more working areas, each presenting different challenges. In one section, miners dealt with underground water seepage, pumps working constantly to keep the tunnels dry. Another area required special roof bolting to stabilize. A fractured rock. Daniel began to understand the constant battle between human ambition and geological reality. As the morning wore on, word of Daniel's presence spread through the mine. By the time they reached the deepest working level at 1,500 feet, miners were less surprised to see him, though reactions remained mixed. Some seemed impressed that the new owner was willing to come underground at all. Others maintained their skepticism, waiting to see if this was just a publicity gesture. In a break room carved from solid rock, Hensley introduced Daniel to shift. Supervisors and senior miners. Over sandwiches and tepid coffee, they discussed current challenges, equipment that needed replacing, safety concerns in the older sections, competition from newer mines with lower operating costs. Daniel mostly listened, absorbing information, learning the language and rhythms of underground work. "The east decline needs new timber," one supervisor reported. "Some of those supports are original, going back to Mr. Charles's time. Still solid, but showing their age. We've been putting it off due to budget constraints," another added, glancing meaningfully at Daniel. "Previous management didn't see it as priority." Daniel looked to Hensley. "What's your assessment?" "Should be done," the foreman said, "without hesitation. It's not critical yet, but waiting until it becomes critical is how accidents happen. Better to be proactive." "Then we do it," Daniel decided. "Give me a cost estimate, timeline, impact on operations. If it's about safety, it's not negotiable." The room fell silent. Then the first supervisor nodded slowly. That's good to hear, Mr. Thornfield. We've been pushing for this for 2 years." As they prepared to return to the surface, Hensley led Daniel through one more tunnel, older than the rest, with timber supports that looked like they belonged in a museum. "This is where it all started," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Charles Thornfield's original strike, the silver vein that built an empire." The tunnel dead-ended at a rock face where a bronze plaque had been mounted. In the dancing light of their headlamps, Daniel read, "Here on July 15th, 1931, Charles Thornfield discovered the silver lode that would become the Crimson Crown Mine. Fortune favors the persistent." "He almost gave up," Hensley said quietly. "Spent everything he had, borrowed more. Margaret, Mrs. Thornfield, she was ready to leave him, go back east to her family. Then he found this vein, changed everything overnight." They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by history. Daniel thought about the parallels, his own desperate circumstances, Margaret's unexpected offer, the gamble that had brought him here. "Did you know him well?" "Charles? Well as anyone, I suppose. He was a hard man, demanding but fair, never asked anyone to do what he wouldn't do himself. came underground right up until his health failed. Hensley paused. He'd have liked that you came down here first thing. Shows respect for the work, the workers. The journey back to the surface seemed shorter, the cage rising through shaft levels where the previous night shift was giving way to day workers. When they finally emerged into blazing afternoon sunlight, Daniel had to shield his eyes, blinking away temporary blindness. The desert heat hit him like a physical blow after the mine's constant cool temperature. "Takes some getting used to," Hensley observed, watching Daniel readjust to the surface world. The transition between worlds. That's what mining is, living in two realities, darkness and light, earth and sky. They returned to the office where Hensley spread out production. Reports, geological surveys, and equipment manifests. The afternoon became a crash course in mine management, understanding ore grades, processing costs, market fluctuations, labor relations. Daniel's head spun with information, but he forced himself to focus, to absorb what he could. "Tomorrow, we'll visit the processing plant," Hensley said as the day wound down. "That's where raw ore becomes refined silver. Different challenges there. Chemistry instead of geology, precision instead of brute force. Then the day after, we'll go through the financial side. Mrs. Thornfield wants you to understand how the physical operations translate to corporate balance sheets." 3 days, Daniel thought again. Always 3 days. Tomorrow the processing plant, the day after financial reviews, and then... What? What was supposed to happen on that third day? As if reading his thoughts, Hensley gathered the papers into neat stacks. "Mrs. Thornfield has something special planned for day 3. Wouldn't tell me what, but she seemed, I don't know, determined maybe, like she was racing against time." The drive back to Thornfield Manor gave Daniel time to process the day's experiences. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of gold and purple. He thought about the miners he'd met, their initial suspicion gradually warming to cautious acceptance, about the mountain's hidden chambers carved by decades of human ambition, about Charles Thornfield's original tunnel, where desperation had transformed into fortune. The manor looked different as he approached, less imposing, more like a responsibility he was beginning to understand. Mrs. Bennet met him at the door, taking in his dust-covered clothes and tired expression with a knowing look. "Hot bath drawn in your suite," she said simply. "Dinner in an hour. Mrs. Thornfield asked that you join her in the study afterward. She has something to show you." The bath was heaven, hot water soaking away the grime and tension of the underground world. Daniel found himself studying his hands, already calloused from ranch work, now bearing new scrapes from steadying himself against rough stone walls. Miner's hands, like his father's had been. Dinner was quieter than the previous evening. Margaret looked paler, moving carefully as she cut her food. But her eyes were alert, studying Daniel as he described his day underground. "Jim says you ask good questions," she observed, "practical ones, and you authorize the timber replacement in the east decline." "It seemed necessary," Daniel replied. "The supervisor said they'd been waiting 2 years." "They have. I've been distracted by other concerns. Corporate battles, legal maneuvers, sometimes the basics get overlooked." She set down her fork, food largely untouched. "That's one reason I needed fresh eyes, someone to see what I'd become blind to." After dinner, they retired to Margaret's private study, a room Daniel hadn't seen before. Unlike the formal library, this space felt lived in, personal. Photographs covered one wall, crimson crown through the decades, miners and executives, social events and groundbreaking ceremonies. Margaret moved to an antique safe in the corner, working the combination with practiced movements. "There's something you need to see," she said, withdrawing a package wrapped in oilcloth. I've debated showing you this, wondered if it was too soon, but time is a luxury I don't have." She unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a leather-bound book, its cover worn with age and handling. "This is my diary," she said simply. "Started the day I arrived in Nevada as Charles's bride. 47 years of observations, doubts, victories, defeats. The real story of Thornfield Corporation, not the sanitized version in annual reports." Daniel accepted the diary with careful hands, understanding the magnitude of trust it represented. "Why show me this? Because in 2 days, you'll need to make a decision that will affect everything. The company, the workers, the legacy Charles and I built. You'll need to understand not just the business, but the choices that shaped it. The compromises, the sacrifices, the reasons behind decisions that might seem cruel or arbitrary from the outside." She returned to her chair, suddenly looking every one of her 70 years. "Read it tonight, all of it if you can. Tomorrow, after you visit the processing plant, we'll talk about what you've learned. And the day after..." She paused, something flickering in her green eyes. "The day after, you'll understand why I chose you. Why it had to be someone like you, with your background, your particular kind of desperation." The weight of the diary in Daniel's hands seemed to increase. "Margaret, is there something specific I should know? Some threat to the company?" Her smile was tired, but genuine. "So many threats, Daniel. Victor Hartley is just the most obvious. There are corporate raiders from back east, environmental activists who'd shut us down regardless of the human cost, politicians who'd sell out this entire region for campaign contributions. But the real threat..." She stood, moving to the window that overlooked the gardens, now silver in moonlight. "The real threat is what we become when we forget why we started. When profit margins matter more than people. When we see workers as expenses rather than partners." She turned back to him, her expression intense. "Charles understood that balance. I've tried to maintain it. But lately I've wondered if I've lost my way. If in fighting to preserve the company, I've compromised the values that made it worth preserving." Daniel thought of the miners he'd met today, their initial suspicion, their gradual acceptance when they realized he genuinely wanted to understand their work. The men underground, they respect what you've built. There's pride there, despite the hard conditions. Pride, yes, but also fear. Fear of change, of losing their livelihoods to automation or corporate consolidation. That's why your decision in 3 days matters so much. Why I need you to understand everything, the good and the bad, the triumphs and the failures." She moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. Tomorrow night, there's a dinner and party here. Business associates, local politicians, some of the board members, your first real test in the social arena. They'll be evaluating you, looking for weaknesses. Be yourself, but be careful. Some of those smiling faces hide sharp knives." After she left, Daniel sat alone in the study, the diary unopened in his lap. Through the window, he could see lights from the mining operation twinkling in the distance like grounded stars. Somewhere out there, the night shift was beginning their descent, following veins of silver through ancient rock. He opened the diary. To the first page, dated September 3rd, 1931. "Arrived in godforsaken Nevada today. Charles met me at the train station, covered in dust, but grinning like a fool. I've found it, Maggie," he said. "The strike that'll make us rich." I wanted to slap him. 3 years of marriage, 2 years of chasing mining dreams across the West, and now this, but something in his eyes. Maybe this time is different. Daniel read through the night, following Margaret's journey from skeptical Eastern bride to mining mogul. The entries revealed a woman of fierce intelligence and determination, documenting not just business dealings, but personal struggles. The loss of pregnancies, battles with male competitors who saw her as an easy target, the slow evolution of her partnership with Charles from practical arrangement to genuine love. An entry from 1943 caught his attention. The war has changed. Everything. Demand for silver is through the roof. Military applications we're not supposed to discuss. Charles wants to expand rapidly, take on debt to finance new shafts. I'm cautious. What happens when the war ends? When demand normalizes? We argue constantly now, but it's good argument. Productive. He pushes, I pull back, and somewhere in the middle we find the right path. By 1960, the tone had shifted. Charles is slowing down, though he won't admit it. Forgets things, delegates more. I'm handling most of the corporate side now. Strange how naturally it comes. All those years of watching, learning, preparing for something I never thought I'd need to do. Some of the board members grumble about petticoat management, but the numbers don't lie. We're more profitable than ever. The entries following Charles's death in 1973 were heartbreaking. The vultures circle before the funeral flowers have wilted, offers to buy me out, suggestions that I'm too grief-stricken to continue. Victor Hartley particularly odious. No shame in admitting you need a man's guidance, Margaret. Wanted to throw him out bodily. Instead, I smiled and showed him our third quarter projections. His face when he realized we're outperforming his operation by 30%, almost worth the insult. More recent entries showed increasing concern. The industry is changing faster than I anticipated. Environmental regulations, new extraction technologies, global competition. I'm 70 now. How much longer can I adapt? Need to find someone to carry this forward, but who? No children, no obvious successors. The board pushes for merger with Hartley, but I'd rather see Crimson Crown shuttered than absorbed into his empire. The final entry was dated just a week. Made my decision. Daniel Sawyer, ranch hand from Morrison's place. Background clean, no connections to complicate things. Desperate enough to accept my terms. Grounded enough to handle the responsibility. Charles came from nothing too. Maybe that's what Crimson Crown needs. Someone who understands struggle, who won't take success for granted. 3 days to show him everything. 3 days to prepare him for what Victor is planning. God, I hope I've chosen wisely. Daniel closed. The diary, as dawn light crept through the study windows. His eyes burned from reading, his mind reeled from the revelations. Margaret hadn't just shared her business history, she'd given him a window into her soul, her fears, her hopes for the future, and that final entry. What was Victor Hartley planning? What decision would Daniel face on the third day? He made his way to his suite, the diary clutched against his chest like something precious and fragile. 3 hours until he needed to meet Hensley at the processing plant. 3 hours to rest, to prepare for another day of learning, of proving himself, worthy of the trust Margaret had placed in him. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Daniel dreamed of silver veins running through darkness, of his father's voice echoing from somewhere just out of reach, of Margaret Thornfield standing at the entrance to Charles's original tunnel, saying, "Fortune favors the persistent." But in the dream, she added something else, and the prepared. In 2 days, Daniel, you'll need to be both. The processing plant tour that second day opened Daniel's eyes to another facet of the mining operation. Here, raw ore underwent transformation. Through crushing, grinding, flotation, and smelting until pure silver emerged. The plant manager, Dr. Sarah Chen, explained the chemistry and engineering with passionate precision. Unlike the miner's initial skepticism, she seemed genuinely pleased to have someone interested in the technical details. That evening's dinner party was everything Margaret had warned about. 20 guests filled the formal dining room. Their conversation a careful dance of business and social maneuvering. Daniel found himself seated between Councilwoman Patricia Hayes, who probed about Thornfield Corporation's political contributions, and banker William Morrison, who seemed particularly interested in the company's expansion plans. Quite a change. From ranch work, Morrison observed, his tone neutral but eyes calculating. Margaret must see something special in you. She sees someone willing to learn, Daniel replied carefully. The mining industry faces serious challenges. Fresh perspective might help navigate them. Across the table, Victor Hartley held court, his silver hair and confident bearing commanding attention. He'd been perfectly cordial to Daniel, but there was something predatory in his smile, like a wolf greeting a lamb it planned to devour later. The key to mining success, Hartley was saying, is efficiency above all. Sentiment has no place in business. Workers are tools. You maintain them properly, replace them when worn out, always remembering their means to an end, not the end itself. Several guests nodded agreement, but Daniel noticed Margaret's slight frown. He thought of the miners he'd met yesterday, their pride in their work, their families depending on Crimson Crown's success. I disagree, he said, his voice cutting through the conversation. The table fell silent. Hartley's eyebrows rose. Oh? And what does our newest mining expert think? I think viewing workers as tools is not just wrong, it's bad business, Daniel continued, feeling Margaret's attention like a physical weight. Tools don't innovate, they don't problem solve, they don't take pride in their work. The miners I met yesterday, they're partners in Crimson Crown's success. Treat them as less, and you lose their expertise, their loyalty, their willingness to go beyond minimum requirements. Idealistic nonsense, Hartley scoffed. Business requires hard decisions, not bleeding heart philosophy. No, my father died in a mine where workers were treated as expendable, Daniel said quietly. The company saved money on safety equipment, rushed production schedules, ignored warning signs, lost 4 good men and faced lawsuits that bankrupted them within a year. Seems to me treating workers as partners isn't idealism, it's practical survival. The silence stretched until Margaret raised her glass. To practical survival, she said, her green eyes finding Daniel's, and to fresh perspectives. Others echoed the toast, but Daniel saw calculation in many faces. He'd made his position clear, drawn lines that some wouldn't forgive. After the guests departed, Margaret found him on the terrace, nursing a brandy, and staring out at the desert night. You handled yourself well, she said, joining him at the railing, though you've certainly made an enemy of Victor. He was already an enemy, wasn't he? Just more polite about it before. Margaret's laugh was soft, tinged with approval. True enough, he's been circling like a vulture for years, waiting for me to show weakness. Her expression grew serious. Did you finish the diary? Yes, every word. Then you know about tomorrow. About the decision you'll face. Daniel turned to study her face in the moonlight. Your last entry mentioned Victor's plans, but didn't specify what they were. Because I wanted you to discover it yourself. Tomorrow we have a board meeting, emergency session called by Victor and his allies. They're going to propose a vote of no confidence in my leadership, citing my health and recent erratic decisions, meaning my marriage to you. They'll push for immediate merger talks with Hartley's operation. The brandy turned bitter in Daniel's mouth. Can they do that? They can try. I still hold controlling interest, but barely, if they convince enough shareholders that I'm no longer competent. She shrugged. Corporate coup. Bloodless, but effective. That's why tomorrow matters. Why you need to be ready. What do you need me to do? Margaret smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Be yourself, the man who went underground to understand the real business, who stood up to Victor at dinner, who's learning that sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with picks and shovels, but with words and wisdom. She placed a hand on his arm. I've given you knowledge, Daniel. Tomorrow you'll need to transform it into power. The third day dawned clear and cold, desert winter asserting itself. Daniel dressed carefully in his best suit, the one he'd worn to the press conference. As he adjusted his tie, he thought about how much had changed in just 3 days. The nervous ranch hand who'd first put on these clothes was gone, replaced by someone who understood the weight of responsibility, the complexity of leadership. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. in Thornfield Corporation's Carson city offices. Daniel rode with Margaret in the back of the company's Cadillac, reviewing financial reports and corporate bylaws during the journey. Margaret seemed calm, but he noticed the slight tremor in her hands, the careful way she breathed. Pain management, he realized. "There's something else you should know," she said as they neared the city. "Yesterday, while you were at the processing plant, I had another medical appointment. The cancer has accelerated. My timeline has compressed." Daniel's chest tightened. "How long?" "Weeks, perhaps. Certainly not months." She said it matter-of-factly, but he heard the steel will required for such calm. That's why Victor moved now. He has sources at the hospital. Knows I'm running out of time. The boardroom was already filling when they arrived. 12 directors, mostly men in their 50s and 60s, some Daniel recognized from the dinner party. Victor Hartley sat at the far end of the table, flanked by supporters. His smile when he saw Margaret was triumphant. "Margaret, you're looking well," he lied smoothly. "And Mr. Thornfield, how are you finding married life?" "Educational," Daniel replied, taking his seat beside Margaret. The meeting was called to order by board chairman Robert Westbrook, an elderly banker who'd served since Charles's time. His expression was carefully neutral as he read the emergency motion, proposal to explore strategic alternatives for Thornfield Corporation, including potential merger with Hartley Silver Works, in light of recent developments affecting leadership. Stability. Couched in corporate language, but the meaning was clear. They wanted Margaret out, the company absorbed into Hartley's empire. The discussion that followed was brutal in its politeness. Directors questioned Margaret's recent decisions, expressed concern about succession planning, suggested that sentiment was clouding business judgment. The marriage to Mr. Thornfield, while perhaps personally satisfying, raises questions about corporate governance, one director stated. "No offense to the young man, but what qualifications does he bring beyond proximity to power?" Daniel listened, watched, learned. He saw alliances revealed in subtle glances, noticed which directors avoided Margaret's eyes, identified the fence-sitters who might be swayed. When the formal presentations ended and discussion opened, he raised his hand. "I'd like to address the board," he said. Surprise flickered across several faces. Victor's smile widened. Apparently, he expected Daniel to embarrass himself. "By all means," Westbrook allowed. Daniel stood, his heart pounding but voice steady. "You're right to question my qualifications. 3 days ago, I was a ranch hand facing unemployment. Today, I'm married to your CEO, positioned to inherit her controlling interest. On paper, it looks like opportunism at best, manipulation at worst." He paused, meeting eyes around the table. "But paper doesn't tell the whole story. In 3 days, I've been underground with the miners, through the processing plant with the engineers, reviewed 40 years of financial records. I've seen Crimson Crown from bedrock to boardroom. And what I've learned is this: Thornfield Corporation isn't just a mining company. It's the economic heartbeat of this region. 3,000 employees, their families, entire communities depend on decisions made in this room." He pulled out a folder, spreading documents across the table. "These are Hartley Silver Works employment records from their last 3 acquisitions. Average workforce reduction, 47% within 18 months. Safety violations up 30%. Community investment programs eliminated entirely. Is that the future you want for Crimson Crown? Victor's smile had vanished. Business requires efficiency. Business requires sustainability, Daniel interrupted. Margaret Thornfield understood that. Charles understood it before her. Yes, I'm new to this world, but sometimes fresh eyes see what experience has learned to ignore. I see a company that's been consistently profitable while maintaining safety, standards, supporting workers' families, investing in community development. I see a legacy worth preserving, not a commodity to be stripped and sold. He turned to address the uncertain directors. You're worried about leadership transition, valid concern, but Margaret isn't proposing to step down. She's ensuring continuity by bringing in someone who understands what Crimson Crown really is. Not just silver extraction, but hope extraction. Not just profit generation, but community building. Pretty words, Victor said dismissively. But what about the numbers? Global competition, rising costs, environmental regulations. Hartley Silver Works has economies of scale that destroy the very communities they claim to serve. Margaret interrupted, speaking for the first time since discussion began. Her voice was quiet, but carried absolute authority. I've been silent, gentlemen, listening to your concerns, your barely veiled ambitions. Now let me be clear. I am not dying. I am transitioning. My body may be failing, but my mind remains sharp enough to see through this charade. She stood, and Daniel saw what effort it cost her. Thornfield Corporation is not for sale. Not to Victor Hartley, not to Eastern investors, not to anyone who views our workers as expendable resources. Daniel has demonstrated more understanding of our true value in 3 days than some of you have shown in years of board service. The motion requires a vote, Victor insisted. The bylaws require a motion to be seconded and to have majority support to proceed to formal vote, Margaret countered. Who seconds Mr. Hartley's motion? Silence. The directors who'd supported Victor in discussion suddenly found the table's wood grain fascinating. Without a second, the motion died. Then we're adjourned, Westbrook declared, relief evident in his voice. As directors filed out, Victor approached Daniel, his composure cracked to show the fury beneath. This isn't over, boy. You've won a skirmish, not the war. When she's gone, and she will be soon, you'll find the real world of mining isn't as forgiving as today's theatrics. After he left, Margaret sank back into her chair, exhaustion written in every line of her face. You did well, she said simply. Better than I dared hope. I had a good teacher. Daniel helped her to her feet, feeling how fragile she'd become. What happens now? Now we go home. I need rest, and you need to prepare for what comes next, running Crimson Crown without me. She smiled sadly. I thought I had more time to teach you everything. But you've shown you can learn quickly, think clearly, act decisively. The rest you'll have to figure out as you go. The drive back to Thornfield Manor was quiet. Margaret dozed, worn out by the morning's confrontation. Daniel watched the desert landscape roll by, his mind churning with everything that had happened. 3 days ago, he'd been nobody. Today, he'd faced down corporate raiders and defended. A legacy he was only beginning to understand. That evening, Margaret's collapse came suddenly. One moment she was walking to the dining room, the next she was on the floor, Mrs. Bennet crying out for help. The doctor arrived within minutes. He'd been staying in Copper Springs, anticipating this moment. Daniel paced the hallway outside Margaret's room, listening to muffled medical conversations, feeling helpless. When the doctor finally emerged, his expression told the story before his words. She's comfortable now, sedated, but her systems are shutting down. Hours, maybe a day or two at most. Can I see her? She's asking for you. Margaret looked, tiny in the massive bed, surrounded by medical equipment that seemed to mock the grandeur of the room. Her eyes opened as Daniel approached, and she managed a weak smile. "Not quite the honeymoon you expected," she whispered. He took her hand, careful of the IV line. "Margaret, no speeches, no deathbed sentiment. Just listen." Her grip tightened slightly. "In the desk drawer, third diary, the one I didn't show you, read it after. After. It explains everything. Why I chose you. What really happened all those years ago. The secret that built Crimson Crown." Her eyes drifted closed, then opened with effort. "Promise me. The workers, the families, don't let Victor or anyone else destroy what we built. Promise." "I promise," Daniel said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. Margaret Thornfield died at 3:17 a.m., with Daniel holding her hand and Mrs. Bennet weeping quietly in the corner. The desert wind howled outside, rattling windows as if the land itself mourned the passing of a woman who'd carved prosperity from its stubborn stone. As dawn broke over Thornfield Manor, Daniel sat in Margaret's study as dawn painted the Nevada, mountains in shades of gold and rose. The third diary lay unopened on the desk before him, a final secret waiting to be revealed. With trembling hands, he opened the leather cover and began to read Margaret's precise handwriting. "If you're reading this, Daniel, then I am gone, and the truth about Crimson Crown can finally be told. What I'm about to reveal will explain everything. Why I chose you, why your father's death wasn't the accident you believed, and why protecting this legacy matters more than profits or power." The words blurred as Daniel rubbed his eyes, forcing himself to focus. The diary continued. "In 1931, Charles didn't discover that silver vein by accident. Your grandfather, William Sawyer, was his partner. They found the deposit together, but a cave-in killed William before they could file the claim. Charles escaped with the location maps. He promised your grandmother he'd share the fortune with her family, but mining laws required a living partner to file jointly. So Charles filed alone, sending money to your grandmother secretly for years." Daniel's breath caught. His grandfather had been Charles Thornfield's partner. The revelation sent his mind spinning as he continued reading. "When your father grew up, he came to claim his family's share. Charles, by then wealthy and powerful, feared exposure. He arranged for your father to work at the Anaconda mine, hoping distance would satisfy him. But Thomas Sawyer was persistent. He gathered evidence, planned to sue. The accident that killed him, Charles arranged it. Not murder exactly, but he bribed inspectors to overlook safety violations, knowing that section was unstable." The diary slipped from Daniel's nerveless fingers. His father's death, the defining tragedy of his childhood, had been orchestrated by the man whose empire he now inherited. Rage and confusion warred within him as he retrieved the diary with shaking hands. "I discovered this truth after Charles died, hidden in his private papers. The guilt nearly destroyed me. I tried to find you, to make amends, but you disappeared into the vast network of ranch work across the West. When you finally surfaced in Copper Springs, I knew it was fate offering redemption. You weren't just a random choice, Daniel. You're the rightful heir to half of everything Crimson Crown built." The next pages contained legal documents, the original partnership agreement between Charles Thornfield and William Sawyer, correspondence about the cover-up, bank records showing payments to Daniel's grandmother. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. I could have simply given you money, but that felt insufficient. Crimson Crown exists because of your family's sacrifice. You deserve more than compensation. You deserve the chance to shape its future. That's why I married you, why I'm leaving you everything. Not charity, but restoration of what was stolen. Daniel set down the diary and walked to the window, staring out at the mining operation in the distance. The morning shift would be heading underground now, following veins of silver that his grandfather had discovered. Men like his father, risking their lives in darkness, trusting that their employers valued safety over profit. The truth changed everything, yet changed nothing. He was still Daniel Thornfield, still responsible for thousands of workers and their families. But now he understood the weight of that responsibility differently. This wasn't just about preserving Margaret's legacy, it was about honoring his own family's sacrifice and preventing others from suffering as they had. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Bennet entered, her eyes red from crying. "Mr. Thornfield, there are arrangements to make the funeral, the company announcement." "Yes," Daniel said, turning from the window. "And Mrs. Bennet, please contact Walter Whitman. Tell him I need to establish a new safety foundation in my father's name. Every Crimson Crown operation will exceed federal standards by 50%. No exceptions." She nodded and left. Daniel returned to the diary, finding Margaret's final entry. "The secret is yours now, Daniel. You can expose the truth, destroy the Thornfield name, tear down everything in righteous anger. Or you can choose differently. You can take this tainted legacy and transform it into something worthy of your family's sacrifice. The choice, as with everything in life, is yours." The funeral 3 days later drew hundreds to the small Copper Springs cemetery. Miners stood beside corporate executives, local families next to state politicians. Daniel delivered the eulogy, speaking of Margaret's vision, her determination, her belief that business success meant nothing without human dignity. He didn't mention the diary's revelations, that truth belonged to the past. What mattered was the future, the changes already being implemented in safety protocols, the new profit-sharing program for workers, the educational foundation Margaret had always talked about but never established. Victor Hartley attended, of course, his presence a reminder that external threats remained. During the reception at Thornfield Manor, he cornered Daniel in the library. "Touching speech," Victor said, his smile sharp as a blade. "But sentiment doesn't run businesses. When reality hits, global competition, market downturns, union demands, you'll learn that hard choices require hard men." Daniel met his gaze steadily. "You're right about hard choices. I've already made mine. Crimson Crown will never be for sale to Hartley Silverworks. Not for any price, under any circumstances." Victor's smile faltered. "Everyone has a price. Boy, I'll find yours. My grandfather died in these mines. My father died because of them. My wife gave her life to preserve them. What price do you put on that kind of legacy?" Daniel stepped closer. "Stay away from my workers, my company, my community. This is the only warning you'll get." After Victor left, Daniel stood alone in the library, surrounded by the books. Margaret had wanted him to read. He pulled out Charles Thornfield's journal, rereading the entry from 1931. "Found silver today," where Thompson said there was nothing but worthless quartz. Now he knew the truth. Thompson had been right. It was William Sawyer who'd found the silver, whose geological expertise had identified the vein. Charles had taken credit for a dead man's discovery, built an empire on a stolen foundation. But Margaret had tried to make it right in her own way, and now it fell to Daniel to complete that redemption. The weeks that followed blurred together. Days spent in corporate offices, learning the complexities of modern mining operations. Evenings reviewing contracts, financial reports, strategic plans. Weekends visiting the various Crimson Crown properties, meeting workers, understanding challenges specific to each site. Resistance came from predictable quarters. Some board members questioned his decisions, especially the expensive safety upgrades. A few senior managers, comfortable with old ways, bristled at changes. But Daniel had learned from Margaret's diary. He documented everything, built alliances carefully, replaced those who couldn't adapt. The breakthrough came 2 months after Margaret's death. A methane pocket in the Crimson Crown's deepest shaft triggered sensors from the new detection system Daniel had insisted on installing. The evacuation proceeded flawlessly, everyone reaching safety before the pocket ignited. The old system would have given them half the warning time, likely resulting in fatalities. Pete Kowalski, the young miner who'd challenged Daniel on his first day underground, found him afterward. "That equipment you pushed for, it saved lives today. My life." He extended his hand. "Thank you." The handshake meant more to Daniel than any board resolution. Word spread through the mining community. Thornfield Corporation became known as the company that put safety first, that treated workers as partners. Recruitment applications tripled. Productivity increased as experienced miners chose Crimson Crown over competitors. 6 months later, Daniel stood in Charles Thornfield's original tunnel, now converted into a memorial. A new plaque had been added beside the old one, in memory of William Sawyer, co-discoverer of the Crimson Crown vein, and all miners who've given their lives to bring light from darkness. Jim Hensley stood beside him, studying the inscription. "Didn't know old Charlie had a partner." "Hidden history," Daniel replied. "Sometimes the truth takes generations to surface." "Like silver," Hensley observed, "pressure and time reveal what's really there." That evening, Daniel visited Margaret's grave. He'd had her buried beside Charles, despite knowing the truth about their complicated relationship. Fresh flowers adorned both headstones, from grateful workers, from community, members who remembered their generosity. "You chose better than you knew," he said quietly. "Or maybe you knew exactly what you were doing. Either way, I understand now. It was never about the money or the power. It was about transformation, turning a stolen legacy into something worthy, grief into purpose, secrets into truth." The wind whispered through the cemetery cottonwoods, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Somewhere in the hills, the night shift was beginning their descent, following veins of silver through ancient stone. But tonight, for the first time since that desperate morning when Margaret Thornfield had offered him an impossible bargain, Daniel felt at peace. He'd entered this marriage as a desperate man, grasping at survival. He'd discovered terrible truths about his family's past, inherited burdens he'd never imagined. But in the crucible of those revelations, something had been forged. Not just a new identity as Daniel Thornfield, but a purpose that transcended personal gain. The secret diary had revealed the dark foundation of Crimson Crown's success. But secrets like silver ore could be refined. Truth could be extracted from deception, justice from injustice, hope from tragedy. Margaret had started that process. Now it was Daniel's to complete. As he walked back to the manor, the lights of the mining operation twinkled in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Victor Hartley's continued machinations, market fluctuations, technological disruptions. But tonight, Daniel Thornfield allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He'd kept his promise to Margaret. The workers were protected, their families secure. The company she'd built with Charles on a foundation of his grandfather's discovery and father's sacrifice would continue, not as it had been, but as it should be. Transformed by truth, strengthened by justice, guided by the understanding that every fortune has a human cost, and every legacy carries the weight of its creation. 3 days. That's all it had taken to change his life forever. 3 days to go from nobody to somebody, from desperate to determined, from ignorance to understanding. The poor ranch hand who'd married a dying woman's fortune had discovered something worth more than silver, the power to transform a tainted inheritance into an honorable legacy. And in the end, that transformation was the greatest fortune of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.